Right now, I want to welcome to the program from the Independence Institute, Research Director Dave Kopel, contributor to the Vala Conspiracy, where you can find his must-read columns on the hidden details and the stuff that Everytown doesn't want to tell you about its proposals. Dave, how are you, sir?
Doing good. How about you?
I am fantastic. I really do appreciate you coming on the program, and these really are must-read articles because, look, Everytown is very invested financially and otherwise in the branding of quote common sense gun safety regulations or common sense gun safety laws, right? They don't want you to call it gun control. They don't want you to think that this is a big deal. It's just a minor little step that won't bother anybody except for bad guys. But as you write at the Vala Conspiracy, for one thing, let's start with this column, how Everytown's background check law impedes firearm safety training and self-defense, because that would seem to be a pretty big deal.
Absolutely. And this whole notion of universal background check, which is promoted by Michael Bloomberg's lobby, is really a classic bait and switch where you sell the consumer one thing, but the product that gets delivered is very different. If they'd wanted to write a law that was just about the private sale of firearms, there's other states in the country, California, for example, that have had laws like that, and they could have copied something like that. But instead, the Everytown Bloomberg model is incredibly more repressive, because it says not only do you need to go to a gun store to have a background check performed when you sell a gun privately to somebody else, but basically every time you transfer a gun to somebody else, and instead of having the normal definition of transfer in firearms law, which is a permanent disposition, they define transfers as any time a gun gets handed off. So, for example, in Washington State, where Initiative 594 was passed with this deceptive approach of saying, oh, this is just about sales, it means that the ordinary mechanics of firearm safety training are now criminal. Because, I'm an NRA certified instructor, and part of basic safety training is you teach people how to load and unload a gun, and also how to hand off a gun from one person to another safely. Make sure the action is open, the gun's unloaded, things like that. And students practice doing that. Well, that's a transfer, according to the new law in Washington State. So in a normal firearm safety class, you'll have dozens, hundreds of transfers take place as the students, just for a few seconds, hand guns to each other and then hand them back, and learn how to do that, how to open the action of the gun, and be safe and responsible. And you can't do that in Washington State anymore. It's now criminal. Unless you go to you do the class at a corporate-owned target range, or B, you go every time you hand off a gun, you got to go to a gun store and have that processed as if you were buying a gun out of inventory, with all the fill out the dozens of questions in the ATF form 4473, call the state police for permission to do the transfer and all that. So they've effectively made normal safety instruction classes impossible unless they take place at a target range.
And as you say, Dave, this language was specifically written and crafted by anti-gun attorneys who I would imagine were actually paid to think about the unintended consequences of what this legislation might do. And if this really were just a simple measure, just an easy thing, then the law probably would have been written in such a way that it made it a easy thing, a simple thing, something that wouldn't make it more difficult for people to engage in these types of firearms training and the again the temporary transfer of these firearms. You could probably write that law, I'm guessing, in a way that this wouldn't be impacted.
Absolutely, and there were models available for them to do that, and these concerns about the vast collateral damage on non-sale activities like safety training, safe storage, like leaving your guns with your neighbors when you go out of town for 3 weeks, so your guns are less likely to get stolen, and get into the black market. Those kinds of things too. Well, you can't do that unless you go down to the gun store. And so you've got a gun collection of, say, a dozen guns, and you want to leave them with your next door neighbor for 3 weeks. Well, you got to go down to the store, and of course, for every single gun, you'd have to fill out a 4473 as if your neighbor were buying a gun. And then you got to call the state government or the FBI and get permission for the transaction, pay whatever fees.
Dave, I just started talking about your second column here about the handgun bans for persons under the age of 21. And again, this is something that is never, ever discussed, right? This is in fact, a gun ban for a certain class of society.
Exactly, because when you say that the only way you can buy or borrow a gun is when you go to a gun, transaction has to go through a gun store as if it were a sale from the gun store's inventory. Well, that means the gun store has to follow its own federal laws. FFLs, gun stores, cannot legally transfer a handgun to a person under 21. And so you've now just made it illegal for, if you want to sell a handgun to your cousin who's 20 years old, it's now impossible to do that because you're only allowed to do that transaction via a gun store, and the gun store can't transfer a handgun to someone under 21. And in almost all of this country, it's legal for people under 21 to possess handguns, and the Bloomberg universal background check law is never touted as having the benefit of being a handgun ban for people under 21, but that's what it is in practice.
Well, and that's the thing, if Bloomberg wants to make the case, and I think that he does actually want to make the case that 21-year-olds should not be able to own handguns. I think he's actually said publicly he thinks that the age should be raised to 24. That seems to me like, Dave, that would be another piece of legislation entirely, right?
It would be, except that would be a hard thing to get a legislative body to pass, but it turns out it's easier to fool legislative bodies or voters into accidentally enacting handgun bans for people under 21 by having it buried as a secondary effect of this universal background check law that says you can't borrow or buy guns except via gun stores.
And you say in the Washington state law that was drafted, again, by anti-gun attorneys, supported by Everytown, you say that only a, quote, bona fide gift between family members is allowed. If family members want to loan a firearm to one another, they must have the loan processed by a gun store. That's for family members, you say?
Yeah, and the Colorado law on that is somewhat better because partly because we raised the issue and the legislature was at least willing to listen on that. It also allows loans by family members. But that's right. In Washington State, you can't loan a gun to someone in your own family unless you go down to a gun store to process the loan as if you loan your gun to your brother to go camping for the weekend. You can't do that unless you go to the gun store and act as if he was buying the gun. Or for that matter, if your sister wants to borrow a gun for 2 hours to go down to the target range and practice, you got to go to a gun store to get permission for that. And then, of course, when the sister's done with the gun at the target range and wants to return to you, go back to the gun store again and act as if you were buying that gun from the dealer's inventory.
Unbelievable. Now, you note in your pieces of the Vala Conspiracy that your analysis of these laws is based on a forthcoming article, Background Checks for Firearm Sales and Loans, Law, History, and Policy. This is coming out in the Harvard Journal on Legislation. And Dave, this sounds like for those of us who actually enjoy reading law review articles, this is something we should be spending some time with.
Well, that would be swell, and the article is available online right now.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, it's a draft, and I'll be uploading an improved version next week. But yeah, it's all available. This is the other side on this issue has been throwing quite a lot of conniption fits over my series, although they've never pointed out anything that's inaccurate about it because it's not. It's what the laws plainly say.
Yeah, haven't they? Was one of their conniption fits saying that well, you need to put a disclaimer on Dave's writing, say that the Independence Institute's taking money from the NRA at points in the past. We got to have that disclaimer there.
Yes, and so that's up there now, and that's fine. That's never been
Oh, I think
a
it's
secret that the Independence Institute, as a think tank, seeks grants from anybody anybody is willing to give. Unfortunately, the Bloomberg organization hasn't been willing to fund to support our research into gun safety and civil rights. But the NRA takes a more positive attitude. And obviously, I write for the American Rifle. Have written for started writing for American Rifleman back in 1988, and I write frequently for America's First Freedom these days. And the Washington Post actually has reported back in 2013 that the Independence Institute, as a think among the places we get grants from, has been the National Rifle Association. So there's no secret there. But that's all the other side can say is, oh, well, he's on the NRA side, which is mostly true. I do agree with the NRA on most issues. And so what they want to do is scream and plug their ears and say, don't listen to that because it's coming from a pro-NRA guy.
It is amusing to see anti-gun activists try to shoot the messenger, Dave, because that's exactly what they're trying to do.
Well, and look, the anti-gun activists, I mean, they're anti-gun activists. The people who give money to groups like the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, which used to be a pretty serious organization back in the 70s and 80s, they get money from people who want to ban guns.
Right. Well, that's why I was kind of interested to see that, because I'm really looking forward to the next person who writes, who's the guy that works for Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health?
Yeah.
Will there be a disclosure that Michael Bloomberg funded the Bloomberg School of Public Health? Any of the anti-gun advocates who've taken a dollar or a dime from a Michael Bloomberg? Will that disclaimer? I assume that disclaimer will now be present on all of their writings at the Washington Post as well.
Yeah, hopefully it's at least implicit if they list the full title, since he bought himself a public health research organization.
Well, what about this, Dave? Everytown did actually fund, remember that? They funded a journalism seminar earlier this year.
Yeah.
So do the journalists who attended that, do they need to have a disclosure that, they attended a program that was funded by Everytown for Gun Safety when they're writing about gun issues? I would think they would.
It all depends, I suppose. I mean, that was the Columbia School of Journalism, which put on the seminar, said, we're getting Bloomberg money, but we're not, they don't have any control over the agenda, and maybe they didn't, although I would say it was the agenda on that had certainly more people on the pro-control side than on the pro-right side.
I think you're right. Well, listen, Dave, I appreciate you coming on the program, sir. It is always a pleasure, and keep up the fantastic work, please.
Well, thank you, and tell your friends and neighbors about the real scam. That's one issue, and people can have a debate on that, but it's really dishonest that all these secondary and extreme controls on non-sale good activities like teaching gun safety and safe storage of guns are being decimated by the subterfuges in the Bloomberg legislation.
Absolutely. Dave Kopel, research director at the Independence Institute, with us here on NRA News, Cam and Company.